We're reaching a point now in terms of drug policy where we're beginning to realize that the war on drugs probably didn't work very well in any respect. But with respect to steroids, we're really not, looking at minimizing those harms in any way, shape, or form typically. As government tries to regulate something, if there's a demand, there'll be a supply.
Yeah.
Economics 101, right?
All right, guys, back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Rick Collins, Esquire. I guess I would say you're a criminal defense attorney.
Yeah,
right? Regulatory lawyer.
Yes.
And specializing in P.E.D.S, the supplement industry, and so on.
That's my gig.
That's your gig. All right. So we'll start with, what's the significance of your hat?
So this is the original OG hat, I think, from when pro hormones were on the market many, many years ago. And there was a company named ErgoPharm, which was one of the first to bring pro hormones, the steroid molecule, as a supplement ingredient to the market. So this is sort of a souvenir hat. I figured, you know what, I'll do my Bev's Gym sweatshirt to represent where I train, and I'll go way, way back to the beginnings of my involvement in the supplement industry with this hat as a souvenir hat. Yeah.
That works. Where I want to start is I've partaked, right, in the anabolic industry.
Okay, have you? Really?
Right, since the 80s, right?
Yes.
So as it's interesting to me how things have shifted, over that period of time, because of regulatory issues and so forth, where I think the way to kind of go over some of the history of this is to start there, because I can comment on like how I was getting things and what those things were. And then here's when it stopped. Right. And now I know why it stopped, but back then I didn't know why it stopped.
Right.
And it's also how you ended up specializing in what you're in.
Right.
Now, we should put out there that your background before being a lawyer was bodybuilding and training and competitively.
Sure. Yeah.
So I don't want people to think it's a lawyer that's got no background in bodybuilding. Your background in bodybuilding far extends.
Yes.
I would say almost everybody that's going to listen to this. So you started bodybuilding in high school, right? Or training in high school.
Yep.
And then through college, you fought the stereotype and doubled down on it.
I did.
Through that, which I cracked up when I heard that one, right? And because it's in law school, especially.
Sure. Yeah.
So how was that?
So, I was a bodybuilder long before I was a law student or a lawyer, walking the walk, competing in NPC shows when, back in, I guess the very early 80s. I've sometimes posted on Instagram my NPC card as it existed then, which looks nothing like anything today. I went to law school. I was lucky. I did very well in college. Got very good grades, did well on my LSATs, and then got a free ride. So I went to law school for free, which for me was an important thing because I was not a rich kid by any stretch of the imagination. I would have gotten crushed in loans. And so because I was able to do it on a scholarship, I was able to ultimately take a job after law school as a prosecutor where you don't get paid a lot, but it's great experience, great trial experience. But when I went to law school, back then, there were very few bodybuilders in, the law school or med school or any kind of the professions generally. And now it's different. Now I get contacted by law students all the time who are like, "Oh, I love your career and I want to be a bodybuilding lawyer," or both men and women. But back then it was rare. And like you say, there are assumptions that get made about muscularity, hypermuscular people. And I'd come out of training and competing at that time. So I was pretty jacked, and suddenly I show up at a law school and people are like, well, he can't have a brain, he's going to fail. He'll never make it through the first year of law school. And, and so dealing with those assumptions, my gut was, instead of trying to prove otherwise, I just doubled down. So I would show up at law school with my hat on backwards and the T. Michael sweatshirt and
tank top underneath,
the whole thing. Yeah. Your scoop neck, boat neck kind of thing.
Baggy pants.
All of it. And but I also made law review in my first year. And they didn't realize I was one of the few there on a full academic scholarship. But it was a fun experience. I went to work as a prosecutor afterwards. And that was sort of, you've got your vocation and your avocation, right? So my bodybuilding was my passion. Bodybuilding was what I did separate from the legal career. And my legal career initially was as a prosecutor, putting the bad people in prison. I had seen enough superhero movies that I wanted to be like the crime fighter, I guess. So that was the closest that I could come to it. And I enjoyed it. I did that for 5 years. And then I went into private practice in 1990, initially doing, the kind of work that most criminal defense lawyers do, representing people who did bad things to other people, hurt other people physically, economically, sexually, whatever it was. And so I did a lot of that. And both as a DA, as an assistant DA, and as a criminal defense lawyer doing that kind of work, I tried a lot of cases. And you really do get experience that you would never get in private practice in the DA's office, because you're given your first week. Here's your caseload. This case is on for trial on Monday. And whether it's in the beginning a traffic case or a misdemeanor and later felonies, you're in court, you're making the arguments to a judge, you're thinking on your feet, you're standing up and making arguments. And that is super important. That's the skill set, that you need. I sometimes tell the story that the initial interview that I had to get the job as an assistant DA was you had to do an opening statement. And you prepare it. It was a fact pattern about this little old lady, Lillian Harrison, who gets robbed on the street. And so I prepared my little opening statement, no notes. You got to just stand up there. And it was a one-on-one, just like you and me. And I come into the office and the interviewer is sitting there, funny guy, good guy. I became friends with him for many years after, and I'm still friends with him. And he said, well, have you prepared your opening statement? I'm like, well, yes. Okay, go ahead. So I'm standing up there and I start telling the story. The time is 7 p.m. The place is Main Street and Vine. Lillian Harrison, 64 years old, is on her way back from work. She's walking down the street northbound. As she's walking, passing a street lamp, she hears a sound. It's footsteps coming from behind her, distant at first, but getting closer and closer. Suddenly, it's right behind her. She turns over her right shoulder to see the face of a man. This man, the defendant, David Tate, as he reached for her pocketbook with his right hand and pulled it from her shoulder, knocking her to the floor. So I think I'm doing great. I'm using and I was an actor at one time. And so I'm using all my acting skills. I'm making it passionate. And in the middle of it, he says, excuse me. Yeah. It's getting a little hot in here. Can you open that window? So I look over and there's a window. It's probably about 5 feet wide. It's got 2 huge handles. I said, okay. So I walk over to the window, put my hands in the handles. I start to pull it. It's not moving. I pull it again. Not moving. He says to me, you're a big guy. You should be able to open a window. So now I'm thinking I'm going to lose this job because I can't open a window. So I pull the window with everything I've got. I can't move it. He goes, all right. Sit down. So I sit down. He goes, all right. It says here that you used to work for Dan, who is an ADA here, and that you were an intern in our office. I said, yeah. He goes, what do you think Dan would do if I were to call him right now and ask him about you? I said, I think he would say that I worked hard. I was punctual. I did memos for him. I think he'd say good things. Okay, let's find out. So while I'm sitting there, dials the phone. He goes, yeah, hey, Dan, it's Pat. Yeah, listen, I just had a guy in here, Rick Collins. He just left. I think there's something wrong with him. He's a little bit off. What did you think of him? What? Women's clothes. Really? Okay, thanks. And he hangs up the phone and he just looks at me and he goes, women's clothes? Now, I had no idea what he was talking about. This is 1980 or 84, I guess. You know, now I know I didn't open the window. I'm probably losing this job at this point. And so I just go, yeah. He goes, when? I go, now. He starts laughing. He goes, I'm shipping you off to a panel. And I got the job. He wanted to see that I would roll with the vicissitudes of life. When you're in a courtroom, a judge can throw anything at you. You know, some of the arguments, the judge may not understand the law. The judge may yell at you for whatever reason. And if you're the kind of person who gets thrown in those situations, if you can't roll with it and think on your feet and come around it, if you get flustered and you're stammering, then, you know, trial work is not for you. If you can roll with the punches, and I did, you know, and he liked that. You know, he saw that I was doing a good job with the opening statement, and so he didn't want to hear any more of that. He now wanted, and then of course I found out that window had been painted shut in 1941. No one had ever opened that window. No one will ever open that window. What did he wanted to kind of fluster me? He wanted to put me, he wanted to put the test. And that was a great test. And so you learn how to think on your feet, how to roll with the punches, both as a criminal defense lawyer and as a prosecutor. And when I went into practice in 1990, talk about timing. Timing's everything. So in 1990, I did in the very beginning, I did a lot of cases involving things other than performance drugs, and only because that's the way you start your practice. But 1990 was the year that Congress criminalized anabolic steroids. And that was the year that I hung out my shingle.
See, that was the difference between where I would get things before was pure pharmaceutical from probably stolen from a pharmacy,
diverted
from a pharmaceutical company,
100%.
And then that abruptly stopped.
So
then it came from Mexico, right?
So Congress in the late 80s started to realize that athletes were abusing anabolic steroids and using them in sports that, you know, not bodybuilding, but, you know, Olympic sports and even down to high school sports. So Congress started getting worried about that. And they held a bunch of hearings in the late 1980s. And the catalyst for really when things got, you know, a lot of attention by Congress was the 1988 Seoul Olympics, where Ben Johnson, the Canadian sprinter, ran the 100 meters, set a world record, got the gold, beat Carl Lewis, the American sprinter, and then tested positive for Winstrol. And the sports world went nuts. You know, what's going to happen to sports? Is this the end of natural abilities? Is this going to become a chemistry contest? And so Congress got very involved in trying to figure out what to do about that. They held a bunch of hearings. Interestingly, and not many people remember this, but the FDA, the DEA, the American Medical Association, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse sent witnesses to testify at those hearings before Congress to say, no, do not schedule anabolic steroids. They don't belong in the same law with heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, all of that stuff. Congress decided not to listen to them because they really wanted to do something to send a message about cheating in sports. And so they put steroids into Category 3, Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act, and which suddenly gave the DEA the authority to go after things and gave a disincentive to the pharmaceutical industry to really produce the drugs, doctors to really prescribe the drugs, pharmacies to want to carry the drugs. And so you had all of the legitimate sources like you were talking about where, okay, yeah, there was a diversion problem. There was a diversion situation where FDA approved products were being diverted from medical use to the folks who wanted to use anabolic steroids for either sports use or cosmetic use, which is really, as we know, the vast overwhelming majority of people are not competing in anything but pickleball, right? I mean, it's this is an aesthetic, cosmetic drug primarily. And so suddenly you had a disinterest in making and prescribing and being involved with the legitimate chemicals, the legitimate FDA approved drugs. And what happens? We learned in Prohibition, right? When you no longer have a legitimate source of supply, a black market explodes. And so suddenly from the FDA approved meds that were used in the 80s, now we had different things appearing. So you had, for example, Mexican drugs, from the pharmacias in Mexico, where you'd have pictures of horses or dogs or farm animals of different types, suggesting that these are veterinary drugs. But of course, they were being made for humans. They were being labeled for veterinary purposes because there might be lesser regulatory requirements or importation issues that might have to be dealt with. And so suddenly you had these bodybuilders using what appeared to be veterinary drugs, and the media picked up on that, of course. And that became the market for a period of time, this black market of drugs that were coming from overseas as finished products into the United States.
Now, before that, what was the reason as to when it was being diverted, the product labels would have the little square on it that said this product, will not enhance sport performance.
Right. Yeah.
So what was the catalyst to have that put on there?
So the American College of Sports Medicine and some of the other medical groups, in what I think they thought was a good idea to try to discourage people from using steroids for non-medical purposes, decided that they would try to sell the idea that steroids don't work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you had some studies that were actually rigged in the 1980s to show that they don't work. I mean, by giving, like 20 milligrams a week or something ridiculous, and then publicizing the results in a way to sort of engineer this public perception that they don't work. Kind of backfired, right? Because when you tell people something that's obviously not true, and the guys in the trenches knew it wasn't true, suddenly you had a complete lack of credibility on the part of the medical community, and that really created a rift between the guys in the gym, the guys in the trenches who were using anabolic steroids in the early 90s, late 80s. And the medical community, which seemed to be completely out of touch with reality. Yeah. And that created a problem because obviously there are health risks involved in the use of any drug. You take a couple of aspirin, your headache's going to go away. You take 2 bottles of aspirin, you go away, right? So, the devil's in the dose very often. And so there's a difference between use and abuse, but certainly those who abuse drugs can have bad side effects. And I think that when the medical community started shopping the idea that steroids don't work to build muscle, their credibility was so diminished that people started to believe that everything that they were saying was not true, including that there might be any health risks associated with it, which is unfortunate. Yeah. And not a message that should ever have been given. But that's what happened to the market, and answer your question. And the market adapts, right? As government tries to regulate something, if there's a demand, there'll be a supply. Yeah. Economics 101, right? And I've often said that when we look at drug policy, there's a certain percentage of the human genome that wants to get high. And you can pass all the laws you want, but the reality is that percentage is going to find a way. They're going to have the demand for drugs, and there are going to be those who will supply those drugs. That's just the reality. And similarly, there's a certain percentage of the human genome that wants to be jacked.
Oh, yeah.
And they're going to have that demand, whatever laws you put in place. And so if you regulate the legitimate source of diverted medicines, FDA-approved medicines, well, then you have this Mexican pharmacia market. If you then crack down on that, which they did in a number of DEA operations like Gear Grinder, if you remember it back in the day.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is what clamped down on that? Because eventually that became disappeared. Yeah. And then it started coming.
I would think there was probably some pressure on the Mexican government. I know they did raid in an operation called Gear Grinder. They shut down a whole bunch of Mexican labs. So they crushed it. And plus, especially after 9/11, there was a much higher scrutiny of what came into the country via airports, et cetera. And so finished product became much harder to get into the United States. And so if you can't get finished product in, then what happens? You know,
the powders.
So then the market shifted again, the demand and the supply. And so what the market now is of course, is powders in a raw form coming from China or Asia, typically coming into the U.S. labeled as creatine or some innocuous substance. And if it gets through customs, then you've got a kitchen chemist in an underground lab capacity creating a esterified injectable, or if he's got a pill press making orals or whatever, and then selling it typically on social media. And hawking it that way. But if you look at from a harm reduction standpoint, and harm reduction should probably be part of any drug policy, maybe the one of the most important parts of any drug policy. So we went from, as you described, FDA approved products in the 1980s, which were made under quality control in clean rooms, in drug manufacturing, pharmaceutical industry facilities, to now a raw powder that shows up and somebody in their kitchen is making it under who knows what quality control circumstances. And now it's going out and being sold over the internet to people of all ages, including people under 18, and being used without medical supervision or monitoring. And I've represented a lot of underground labs in over the years. And some of the guys are unbelievably fastidious and meticulous about the quality control of their products, but some are not. And some, when you look at the DEA video of the crime scene of where it was being made, and you see where the cat was walking over, things that people are injecting into their bodies, and some maybe the dosages may or may not be what they purport to be. You're thinking, well, somebody's injecting this, and the same would be true of even some of the other, from SARMs and some of the other things that are on the market as well. You've escalated the risks, you've escalated the harms by the crackdown policies on the legitimate sources of supply. So I think we're reaching a point now in terms of drug policy where we're beginning to realize that the war on drugs probably didn't work very well in any respect. And so we're scaling that back in many ways, at least with respect to heroin and cocaine, maybe in some ways inappropriately. Maybe we shouldn't be giving people free market, open air places where they can inject as much heroin as they want and then wander the streets. Maybe we've gone too far in terms of tolerance and allowing or maybe even encouraging people to continue drug use. But with respect to steroids, we're really not looking at minimizing those harms in any way, shape, or form. Typically, there's only been one movement to deschedule testosterone out of the Anabolic Steroid Control Act. And when I say the Control Act, that law passed in 1990. It was limited to 27 different compounds. It didn't really cover a lot of the pro-hormones that were coming out into the market. And so in 2004, it was amended to include a whole bunch more andro and other type of products that were on the market. And even that was a fail. So Congress, doesn't get sometimes the best advice on how to make a law, especially in this kind of very niche area. And so in 2014, they took a third stab at it. And that was the law, the Designer Anabolic Steroid Control Act, that really is the law that exists now and really did decimate the market for pro-hormones, for steroids being called supplements and hitting the market that way.
Now, after 9/11, was it the supply hit because the government could now search any package for any reason, whereas before they couldn't do that?
So one of the things that people should know is that you have privacy in a mailed package. So if I mail Dave Tate a package, the government can't open that.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. Domestically.
Yes.
They can't without a search warrant.
Yeah.
They get a search warrant, they can open it up. They've got a reason, they go to a judge, they say they have probable cause, which is the basis for that. Now, international mail is different. So if I mail Dave Tate a package from Greece, now it's similar to walking across the border or appearing at an airport and going through. Look, you go through the scanner, they can randomly say, you know what, put your hands out. We're going to scan you. So there's very little protection at international borders. And so that is the same logic that allows them to search a package, an international package, without a warrant. So I think, that was the law prior to 9/11. But I think 9/11 just made it so much more important to the government to really think about what's coming into the country. And so you have scanners that are checking, so they see a bunch of vials in a package coming from Thailand or Greece, and they're not stupid. Yeah. So they kind of know what it is. Some of them get through because but some of them don't. And if they don't, well, then the government has a menu of choices of what to do about that, right? So I've now, let's say I'm working in an airport and I've now got a package with 100 10cc vials of what appear to be anabolic steroids. So maybe I call up the FDA or the DEA and I say, you got to take a look at this. And maybe they test it and they find out, yeah, these are, it's testosterone cypionate. So now what do we do? Well, it's 100 vials. So what do we do? Well, maybe the DEA says, well, we'll do a controlled delivery of this. And what that means is that they dress somebody up as a mail carrier under the supervision and surveillance of other agents. And they knock on the door and the guy comes and they say, here's your package. And once he takes it into the house, well, that triggers the execution of a search warrant. Sometimes the package is actually wired so that when he opens it sends an alert to the agents. And suddenly there's 20 agents swarming the guy's house, taking anything that might be evidence of the crime. So that would include his computer or other electronics that might show that he ordered it and his communications with the source. I've seen them seize bodybuilding magazines, as part of the evidence to show that he just didn't happen to receive a prank package, that he's a person who is more likely to have been intending to receive it. Yeah. And so that's one way, but they don't always do that. Sometimes they send out a seizure letter, which is simply a letter saying, hey, we've got your steroids and we don't think you should have them, but if you've got a good reason for it, let us know. Contact us and we'll be happy to talk to you about your steroids. And it'll say, typically, if we don't hear from you in a set period of time, we're going to destroy it. And most people just ignore that. And so, but they get put into a database so that their address and their name and other indications of who they are in the customs database. And so if it flags that more packages are showing up, at some point, maybe they'll go to that other route.
Yeah, I've known people that have had both happen. you know, and I know other people to where, you know, it's kind of common knowledge that if the package is delivered, you just don't do anything. You just hopefully just let it sit on the step.
Right.
Wait a few days.
Right.
And then take the risk for it.
Right. Yeah.
But
They
don't
won't
answer
you
the
try
door.
to wait them out. You know?
Don't answer the door.
Yeah.
And then if you are dumb enough to answer the door, don't let them in.
Right.
You know, they need a warrant,
Right.
you know, just basic stuff like that. But the people that I know that would get busted would be the ones that would get the letter.
Right.
And never understood this, by the way, and then be dumb enough to go pick it up. It's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You know, but they had so much invested,
right?
You know, that they thought that was worth that risk. And it's just kind of ridiculous.
Well, if in the situation, if they really want you and in the situation where you try to wait them out, they'll sometimes then just do what's called a knock and talk where, you know, okay, you didn't pick up the package. It's still sitting there or whatever. Here we are. We're from the DEA. We know what you ordered. We know what you're doing. We want to talk about it. You can choose not to talk to us, but then we're going to continue to investigate this case. If you want to sit down and talk with us, we know what you did. We know you ordered it. Talk to us. And then if somebody does, well, that's how they build the case. So my recommendation, and it's the recommendation that any criminal defense lawyer would make, is number one, unless agents have a warrant to enter your house, you have no obligation to let them in. And it's always okay to just say, do you have a warrant? No? Okay. I'm going to call my lawyer. He'll talk to, he'll talk to you. But he's told me that without a warrant, you can't come in. Okay. So I don't consent to you coming in. And the same would be true. I've had situations, and we could talk about some examples of cases I've had, at some point, but if the police stop you and they say, where are you going, Mr. Tate? And you mind if we take a look in your trunk? You have every right to say, I have nothing problematic, but I don't consent. I choose not to consent. That's the advice of my lawyer. And then they'd have to get a warrant to move forward. So you certainly don't have to consent to that. And secondly, you don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to, well, did you order a package? You don't have to answer that, yes or no. And answering it either way is problematic. So if they ask you questions saying, did you order steroids? Are you involved with steroids? Is this your package? And you say, no. Well, if that's not true, you're lying. And you're lying to federal agents in the capacity of their employment. What does that mean? That's what's called a 1001 violation. And that's what Martha Stewart went to jail for. You can't lie to federal agents. You have to tell them the truth. If you ask, you don't have to answer questions, but if you choose to answer the questions, they better be honest answers. So lying and denying a crime can get you in trouble just if it's not true, right? And saying, yes, I did order it, and yes, but it was my first time, whatever. Well, all of that is going to be written down, and all of that is going to be used. And I've seen people, by answering questions, walk themselves into a case against themselves that never would have existed because there wasn't sufficient evidence for probable cause until the person opened their mouth. And one of the most devastating pieces of evidence in a criminal case against somebody is their own words. If you make a confession, and the confession you may not even realize the significance of the confession. They may ask you questions which supplement other information they have that then gives them probable cause. So bottom line is, you have every right to say, I'm happy to speak with you, but I need to do it with my lawyer. And I have a lawyer. He's told me he'll handle these things. Give me your business card. Give me your phone number. He'll be more than happy. I'll be perfectly cooperative. And then let the lawyer handle it. I've had clients who, ask me for my card in advance just in case something would ever happen. And they've actually put it through the little screen, the opening in the screen of their door so as not to let them in, because obviously they'll say, listen, we're here. We want to talk. It's cold out here. Your neighbors are watching. Why don't you just let us come in and we can sit down inside? Of course, once you let them in, they're going to be scanning the room for anything that might give them probable cause to arrest you, right? So you're on that slippery slope to a case against yourself. So, don't consent to warrantless searches. always ask for a lawyer, mention a lawyer, and don't answer any questions either by admitting or denying, because both of those are problematic. So that's legal recommendations 101 for everybody, and it applies not just to steroid cases, but really to any case where you're concerned that you may have a problem.
I can remember, probably going back 20 years now, where there would be knocks on doors without packages, just because they were on some list and all they're really doing is trying to fish for who they got it from.
Right.
And that's kind of how you could always figure out who ratted who out.
Yes.
Because you could track that trail back.
Right.
But the trick was never get on the list in the first place.
Sure.
That was the first thing.
Yeah.
And then to not say anything, it's the same thing, but they're tricky. They can be really, really tricky. And I think that's where a lot of these guys would slip up.
Yes.
Is they say no. They would dig a hole for themselves.
Right.
And then end up on probation for 5 years for absolutely nothing.
For something stupid.
Because they never came in and got anything.
Right.
Which is a mind-blowing thing that was back then. It's from my perspective, that it was more personal use cases.
Right.
People were getting heated for that.
Right.
And if I'm being completely transparent, it usually came from somebody sold something to a high school kid that got to their parents. The parents get pissed off, call the police station. They have no choice at that point.
Right.
Even if they don't care, which they probably don't.
Yeah.
But they do then.
Right.
Right. Because
that's the reality.
Yeah, a parent just called. They can't ignore that.
Yes.
And then that leads
once
to
it's in their face. I don't think, there was a time earlier in my handling of these cases where I did see more common personal use arrests. There was a time when that went on. And I've dealt with a lot of cases where, back in the day when finished products were coming in, somebody orders a tub of the Anabol, something like that back in the day, and there's 1,000 tabs in the tub, and suddenly it appears at an international airport. And back then they're looking at this like, wow, there's like 1,000 tabs of ecstasy. This is a serious case. We got a big time dealer. And so this guy who really was the minimum amount that he could have ordered from the Thai source. And suddenly this guy it's a purely personal use scenario. And that
they're stocking up.
They're pack rats, right? You want enough for a few cycles if you're going to get it. And then you get a better price that way too. So suddenly this guy who just wanted a better price and wanted enough for his personal use cycles is suddenly being deemed a dealer of like 1,000 tabs is crazy. And so I would wind up getting involved in those cases either because the client would call me or because a lawyer would call me and say, we need to get you into this case. Would you work with us on this case to educate the judge and the prosecutor and the agents that, no, this is not like 1,000 tabs of ecstasy. Guys are taking, 10 pills a day, and this is just a couple of cycles. So I did a lot of that work for a period of time. I don't see those anymore. I think now, like you say, there's usually a catalyst for it, whether it's, the kid who his mom calls and says, here's the steroids. I've seen where the boyfriend is caught stepping out on the girlfriend, and the girlfriend calls the police and says, I've got his treasure trove of anabolics here, that rat bastard. This is what and suddenly they come and they're faced with all these steroids. I've seen even situations where the guy's coming back, for whatever reason he gets stopped for a traffic infraction and it's sitting on the seat, so if it's right there, yes. The agents there are occasional cases where they go after bigger steroid traffickers. It happens, but they're fewer and far between. I wind up probably getting most of those cases nationwide. And I was figuring the other day that I think I've practiced law or advocated in steroid or other cases in 41 different federal courthouses across the country. I've been from coast to coast, north to south, east to west. I don't know if it's a record, but it's probably not too far from it, all within my sort of niche, because there really are no other lawyers who do this kind of work. And I'm passionate about it, and I'm knowledgeable about it. And my clients, often become my social media followers and friends through the years, who want to see what my journey is and be part of that. I'm probably one of the few criminal defense lawyers in the country who doesn't typically have to represent anybody who has economically, physically, or sexually harmed another human being. It's typically just people who are dealing gear or involved in some way. Obviously, I represent athletes in cases where they're accused of violating sports rules. I represent a lot of police officers and others if they get a steroid test or sometimes some police departments are doing steroid testing. And sometimes they test not for anabolics alone, but also for the other things that you would be tested for in a sports doping case. So I had a guy a few years ago, a cop who tested positive for clenbuterol, and they wanted to take away his job, his pension. His whole life was collapsing. This guy was on the job for like 13 years, a good cop. He wasn't, no instances of excessive force. He wasn't a big, maniac by any stretch of the imagination. He was just a nice guy. And suddenly I remember speaking to the prosecutor and saying to her, this is not a steroid. This is clenbuterol. This is a beta-2 agonist. This is a bronchodilator that's permissible in other countries. We have albuterol in this country, but this is, at most, it's a stimulant. It's not associated with roid rage or aggressiveness or any of the things that you may think would underlie this policy. And her response was, well, we have a zero tolerance policy. I said, okay. Zero tolerance for anabolic steroids. Yes. This isn't anabolic steroids, I know, but we have a zero tolerance policy. So it was this circular, crazy conversation. I wound up trying the case. I spent a week in the trial room, calling in witnesses. They called the architect of the Major League Baseball doping program. I called a witness from California. We had experts. It was this crazy battle. And at the end of the day, I won, and he was reinstated. He got his back pay. He got his pension back. He got his job back. And I think he even sued the department, but for what they did to him. But you're dealing sometimes with prosecutors or others who, as well-meaning as they may be, just aren't getting it. And so I'm kind of the guy who sometimes gets brought in to work in those cases.
How have the counts changed over the years? You talk about the 1,000 tie D-ball. Right. So at one point in time, wasn't it 50 were one count?
Yes. You remember that? You remember those days?
Yeah. And now it's like, is it one count per?
So the way that in just an overview, in federal cases, there's something called the U.S. Sentencing Guidelines, and they advise judges on how much prison time should be advisory toward a particular crime. And for steroid cases, like other drugs, it's the quantity of drugs that forms sort of the base offense level. There can be enhancements above and below for other factors and circumstances, but the base offense level is where you start. And so the more units of steroids, the more prison time you're looking at. So the unit is an important thing. So prior to 2006, a unit of steroids was defined as in terms of injectable liquids. It was basically a 10 cc vial was one unit. Yeah. And 50 tablets, so Thianabol, was one unit. Okay. So when you really do the math of 50 and the vials, you needed a lot of steroids to be looking at any substantial prison time, admittedly. And so the Guidelines Commission started to look at whether that needed to be increased, because DEA was saying, this is ridiculous. Nobody's going to prison for, a boatload of steroids and they're getting probation. And I was brought in as the consultant and expert by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to help educate the commission on some of these issues. So I went to Washington, and they were trying to actually remove the cap. Right, at the time, the cap was 40,000 units, and whether it was 41,000 units or 4 million units, it was capped out at a level 20. They wanted to remove that cap, which would have meant if you had 80,000, you'd be way, way higher. I advocated not to, for a whole lot of reasons, including steroids are used by pack rats. And so the quantities that they use aren't the same. You can't treat it like different Schedule III drugs, because, it's different if you're using it for psychoactive purposes and you're using it for physical purposes. And steroids are the only drug in the entire Controlled Substances Act that are not typically taken for a psychoactive effect. You're not looking to get high. You're not looking to stimulate yourself, depress yourself, have hallucinations. You're looking to get jacked. You're looking to build some muscle and maybe get a six pack for, the summer and, on the beach. So, as a practical matter, you can't treat it the same. And I was able to keep that, they listened and did not increase the cap with respect to steroid charges. But they did change the computation, because their position was that nobody could ever go to prison under the old law and under the old model. And so what they did was they made it 0.5, so a half of a milliliter became a unit. So that 10 cc vial was now 20 units. So big difference, right? A 20-fold increase in the calculation of the dose of the unit. And instead of the 50 tablets, it's 1 tablet. So you had a 50-fold change. So if you do the math in a higher level of quantity, there was a profound difference.
So then anybody's at a 20 count.
So
pretty much
any trafficker, and they actually included the powder potential, because they were made aware that obviously some of this. So it's 25 milligrams typically was sort of the guide for powder. So if you do that math, if you've got basically 1.5 kilos of powder, sip, whatever, that would be the max. That would max you out at the level 20 in the guidelines. So whether you have 1.5 kilos or 500 kilos, you're at level 20. So now, will a judge take the 500 kilos into account in sentencing you as maybe a way of treating you above the guidelines? Sure. And there are arguments, and that's what, there are arguments in sentencing between the defense counsel and the prosecutor that can be very substantial. I've done here essentially steroid sentencing hearings where you're even calling witnesses to determine how the guidelines should be applied to a particular case. So even in a situation where somebody's convicted after trial, or they take a plea, you can still wind up in heavy litigation as to what is the appropriate sentence. And a sentence should be sufficient, but not greater than necessary for the interests of justice. And that's one of the arguments that I make. What is a sufficiently, what's a sufficient sentence for this case? Do we have to really punish them? And I've been very successful in getting non-guideline sentences below whatever the applicable guideline is. So let's say the guideline for a level 20, you go up and down with different enhancements, but maybe you're at around, let's say you're at 3 years, somewhere around 30 to 37 months or something like that. My argument is to try to get less than that, to try to maybe get some sort of home detention or something along those lines. And I've been able to do that even on those kind of guideline cases. I've got my bag of tricks that I apply, and all the machinations and magic that I try to do in these cases. It's funny, I've had cases all over the country. And sometimes it's unexpected the way cases can go when you deal with some of these guideline issues. So I had a case in Dallas a few years ago, And I was called in. There were 2 local Dallas lawyers who were already on the case. And it was a combination case, really, because it was a guy who ran health food stores, and he was selling pro hormones, which, at that time, were arguably not under the definition of an anabolic steroid. At least that was certainly my argument. I think I was right. And he was also dealing some steroids as well, but in much smaller quantities from sort of under the counter kind of thing.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So the prosecutor was putting all of that together for the purposes of the guideline calculation in units, which was very high. My argument was you're wildly overestimating what the applicable guideline is, because all of these other things are not within the drug definition of an anabolic steroid. So that was my argument. So the prosecutor was a very smart guy. And he was looking for 8 years for this guy, 8 years. And the local 2 Dallas guys were looking for a 3-year sentence. But none of them really understood any of this. They were, they were not well informed. And so I was brought in first as sort of the outside consultant guy. And then when I started to realize, and the client realized that I had maybe a better grasp on things, suddenly I was like the lead guy in the case. And so it was kind of me against the prosecutor. And the prosecutor, interestingly, was a DC guy and smart guy. Didn't really jibe well with the local Dallas guys, had a different vibe to him. And I'm a New York East Coast guy. We actually kind of hit it off. And so I enjoyed the chess match with him. We sparred back and forth, and he kept trying to come up with ways that the client would go to prison.
Yeah.
And I kept trying to come up with ways where he wouldn't go to prison. And so we went back and forth. And I remember one time he called me on the phone and he came up with this theory by which prison would be applicable and appropriate. And I said to him, you know what? I've been doing this a long time. And that is the most creative and brilliant argument that I have ever heard from a prosecutor in a steroid case. I am so unbelievably impressed. I mean this sincerely. You're wrong. You're wrong. But it's brilliant. Well, why am I wrong? Well, you're wrong because, and I stated, so ultimately we wound up calling like the U.S. Sentencing Hotline Commission in Washington and presenting this, getting an advisory ruling on how the guidelines applied. And ultimately I was told, you're right. And he said to me, what are you looking for in this? I said, I'm looking for probation. He said, done. And the guy got probation. And I'm still friends with his family. A lot of my clients and their families ultimately become friends, because you're really helping somebody out in these cases, somebody who has no real criminal record. Most of my clients don't have any criminal record or not really drunk driving, maybe at worst. And so these are people, this is like the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their lives. This is like a cancer diagnosis. And I'm the oncologist who's coming in and I've cured their cancer. And it's just a wonderful thing. I'm so blessed and passionate about what I do. I love what I do. I can't see myself ever retiring because I enjoy it too much. But, that's sort of like an example of really making a huge difference in somebody's life. And had I not been there, with my unique little weird set of skills, it wouldn't have gone that way. And I've had lots of cases like that all over the country. Just loving what I do. How
have the cases changed over the years?
So I don't think that, they vary. I don't think that the personal users are really under fire like they used to be. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that anybody go out and possess gear, Well,
you're not giving legal advice either, so we should put that out there.
Yeah, I always say, don't construe anything I'm saying as legal advice or medical advice. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, at least not yet. But yeah, so none of this is legal advice, but certainly, look, there's always a chance that anybody's going to be arrested, and you are doing something that's in violation of the law. And if you have a problem, you can always call me. My office line is open 24/7, and I travel all over the country. A couple of years ago, I had a case where a woman called me. She was a female bodybuilder, high-ranking amateur bodybuilder, jacked, super jacked. And she called me from a Western state, and she said, "Rick, I need your help." I said, "Okay, what's going on?" "Well, I'm accused of selling 1 vial of testosterone to an undercover snitch, an undercover informant in my gym, in my little training facility, my studio gym, in this small little town that she lived in. And I didn't do it. I did not sell him anything. He's lying, and I need you to help me." So I said, "Okay." So I call up the prosecutor on the case. This is a state court case, and I've handled many state court cases as well. I'll bring in local counsel, typically, who knows the judge and knows the prosecutor, sort of the home cooking, rather than just some guy from New York doing it. But I'm the guy with the knowledge that needs to be part of the case. And so I call up the prosecutor and I say, what's up with this? He's like, "Well, she may say she didn't do it, but it's an open and shut case. I've got her dead to rights." Okay. So we have an undercover informant who knows steroids because he's working off his own steroid case. He's been charged with steroids. And he called her up and talked to her on the phone about having her give him training lessons and a diet. And then he asked her about anabolic steroids. And she said, "If you come into the gym tomorrow, I will sell you a bottle of multivitamins. And inside, I will insert a 10 cc vial of testosterone. And I will charge you $100 when you come to the gym tomorrow." So he then calls up the agent that he's working with and the local cop and tells about this conversation. It's not recorded because it was a cold call. So the agent meets him the next day. The agent does a pat down of him a few blocks away from her gym, gives him the money, gives him $100, and puts a wire on him so that there'd be an audio recording of what happens. And he then drives his car the few blocks, parks in front of the gym, walks into the gym, has a conversation with her. They go into her private area, little private room. And there's a conversation about training and about diet. And at some point, he asks about steroids. And she says something, because I hear the tape. Steroids are part of competition at the elite level, but I don't recommend them for everybody. To which he says, "Well, do you have that bottle of multivitamins that we talked about yesterday?" And she goes, "Oh, yeah, of course." And so they go out and a transaction occurs at the counter. He then goes back to his car. He drives over to where the agent is waiting, gets out of the car, gives the agent the bottle of vitamins. Agent opens it up. You know what's inside? 10 cc vial of testosterone. So, wow, just like he said it would happen, right? And so a couple of weeks later, they appear at her house with a search warrant, and they find anabolic steroids in the bedroom in one of the nightstands. It's actually on her husband's side of the nightstand, but they find steroids there. And so the prosecutor says to me, "In this state, we have what's called a 3 strikes and you're out law." What that means is the first strike was that drug conversation, the cold call. The second strike was the actual transaction the following day. The third strike was the recovery of the anabolic steroids in her home. Those 3 strikes give her a 10-year exposure. She's looking at 10 years in prison if she goes to trial and she loses. Now, I'm willing to give her probation. I'll give her probation. I'm not looking to screw her life up, but she's got to plead guilty and she's got to admit what she did. And then she won't get the 10 years. But if she doesn't, we'll try this case and she's going to get 10 years if she's convicted. So I call her back and I explain what he told me. And she says, I don't care what he says. I will go to jail for 50 years. I am not pleading guilty. I am not pleading guilty because I did not do this. So you're in that situation now as a defense lawyer. You know, she didn't have a huge amount of money and, you know, but I believed in her and I didn't like what was going on. And so I wound up, you know, getting the copy of the tape. And there are two things that you can use as a criminal defense lawyer. One is you get discovery. So you're able to hear the audio tape. So and I listened to it. I had my office personnel listen to it because I wanted to make sure that what I was hearing was what everybody else was hearing. And the second thing is, in that particular jurisdiction, you were able to do a deposition before you could depose the witnesses in a case. That doesn't happen in many states. Most states don't allow that. So I want to depose the cop and the snitch. I want to talk to them in advance of the trial so I can see, all right, you know, let me hear what they have to say before I make the decision of whether I want to roll the dice on a 10-year sentence for this woman, right? No prior criminal history. And she was saying, you know, look, why would I sell steroids? This is like a studio gym. I have business people here. This isn't a meathead gym. You know, yeah, sure. I compete in what I do, but I would never sell a steroid. So one thing leads to another. I jump on a plane. I fly out there. I wind up driving 2-3 hours up into the mountains to this little tiny town where I think Wyatt Earp was once the sheriff, believe it or not. And we come in and I got a local criminal defense lawyer to be the local guy. There's a system, you know, application called Pro Hoc Vici, which enables a lawyer from another jurisdiction to practice on a particular case in that jurisdiction. So he supported and sponsored me for that. And he was a good guy, older guy, kind of like the dean of the legal community. And I remember the night before we had to do these depositions, he was just really, you know, beating her up to try to get her to take a plea, just saying, you know, you're going to go to prison for 10 years. What are you thinking? You can't do this, et cetera. And I was more like, you know, let's see what happens tomorrow. I believed in her. So we show up the next morning and the prosecutor says, oh, I got bad news. I'm like, what's the problem? He goes, the snitch is not available. You know, he had a family issue. He can't come in. So we can reschedule. I'm like, reschedule? I flew in. I drove. I'm in the middle of the mountains here. Yeah. You know, I'm not, what are you talking about? He goes, well, you know, he's not available. But the cop is here, but he's not. I'm like, well, okay, then I'll come back. I got a packed schedule. I got a lot of people who are calling my name. I'll come back in 2-3 months. He goes, well, that's the problem, because if she doesn't decide on the plea in 30 days, it's withdrawn. That's our rule here. So you'd have to come back within 30 days. I'm like, I can't come back within 30 days. He goes, well, if she doesn't, then you're going to trial, and she's looking at the 10 years. So I had to decide. Those are the you know, when we talk about thinking on your feet, you got to make those split-second decisions of what do you do in the best interest of this person. So I said, I felt pretty confident that I had something that was of great value to her and could be expressed through this deposition that might get the case to go away. And so I said, you know what? Can you get him on the phone? He goes, yeah. I said, okay, we'll depose him by phone. Never did a phone deposition before. Yeah. I'm not sure many lawyers ever have, but that's the sort of creativity sometimes that's required. So I get so we're sitting there. First, I cross-examine the agent, who admits that, yes, he gave him the money. Yes, he searched him, but he didn't search his socks. He didn't search his pockets, and he let him drive his own car, and he didn't search the car. So in theory, that 10cc vial could have been secreted somewhere prior to him going into the gym, but after he was searched by the agent. Yeah. Okay. And I find out that he was working off his own steroid trafficking case, where he was given a deal where if he could set up 3 people, he would get a misdemeanor. And he had set up one, and that was like 7 months earlier. So he was probably getting desperate to set somebody up. And if you wanted to set up somebody for steroids, physically, she appeared to be low-hanging fruit for that purpose, right? And I wasn't overly wild about the idea of going in front of a jury, with her on the case, so which also made me want to try to see if I could resolve it through this deposition. So I get the guy on the phone and I'm asking him questions, and he admits to all of those things. And then he says that she gave him, basically, he went to the counter and she gave him the bottle of vitamins, and inside was the vial. And I said to him, so you're saying that this bottle of vitamins contained the contraband that you were told to go in and get, right? Yes. And you understand that was the evidence in the case, right? That's the most important part of the case, right? I mean, that's the essence of it. That's the gold for you, right? And so you immediately took that bottle and brought it back to the police officer you were working with, right? Oh, yes, because you wouldn't have gone anywhere else, right? No. You understand you want to have a direct link, right? Yeah. You understand the idea of chain of custody, right? Maybe you ever hear of that? Oh, yeah. So you didn't go anywhere else, right? Really? Well, I did have to go to the bathroom. Wait a minute. So you went to the bathroom before you brought that bottle of vitamins with that evidence that you're saying was inside it? You went to the bathroom before you went outside and gave it to the cop? Oh, yes. I had to go. You had to go so badly that you couldn't wait just a few minutes until after you gave this precious, precious evidence to the cop that you were working with? Oh, I had to go so bad. Number one or number two? He goes, number one. I go, okay, so your bladder was so engorged that you could not wait. You had to go in there. Yes. And you did? Yes. So you went into the bathroom alone? Yes. You closed the door? Yes. Only you in that bathroom? Yes. What this knucklehead didn't realize was the tape was running the entire time. So I heard his transaction at the counter. I heard him go into the bathroom. I heard on the tape him closing the door, locking the door, taking his keys and putting them on the sink. You could hear it. I heard him with the cellophane of the bottle, as you hear the crinkling of cellophane, and actually heard the tapping of the big multivitamin tablets as they hit the porcelain of the bowl, as he scooped out enough to put that vial into the bottle to have room for it before he closed it up. What you didn't hear in that entire time was a single tinkle of liquid. Nothing. So when I confronted him with this, he's like, well, I don't like the way this is going. I said, yeah, there's a name for what you've done. You know what it is? It's called perjury. That's what you've just done. Well, I want to talk to my lawyer. I go, I don't blame you. You probably should. You're in a whole shitload of trouble, my friend. I mean, and he hangs up the phone. I look over at the prosecutor. He's white as a sheet. He's looking at me. I go, well, he goes, would you take a misdemeanor? I said, no. I'll tell you how this is going to go. You're going to drop all charges against this woman. And I'm going to try to convince her not to sue you, the cop, and your entire department. How's that? He goes, I could live with that. And so that was the end of the case. And she's to this day one of my dear friends on social media. So many of my clients become my friends. I love her to pieces. She's always, we stay in touch. But another lawyer may not have made those choices. That was a guy who was desperate to set somebody up, and what a piece of shit to just set up a woman who did nothing wrong because it was in his best interest. So, I've had a lot of cases where I'm just grateful to have been able to play a role in sort of, really redirecting the rest of the course of somebody's life.
What's the difference between a state and federal case?
So the same facts can be either one. Federal drug cases are based on the idea of an interstate. There's got to be an interstate commerce component to it. And all drugs, they don't come from, steroids don't come from Ohio.
So, right? I would think that would make it
always, they're always, but typically the feds have certain thresholds that, unless it's a case where they're really looking at either getting a lot of money or getting a lot of prison time, they usually won't bother with it, typically. So there are situations where even if the DEA or the FDA, federal agency, is the investigating agency, a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor is like, I'm going to pass. I'm not going to take it. So then maybe gets dumped down to the state. Obviously, if state agents are the ones, if the police, the situation where the phone call comes and the girlfriend shows all the steroids to the local police, well, then it's going to stay a state case typically. So part of it is who the investigating agency is, and part of it is the size of the case. And whether you're better off being charged federally or state really depends. A number of years ago, I had a case in the state of Virginia involving pro-hormones with a guy who was like a major pro-hormone manufacturer back when it was still kind of in that gray area of legality, and certainly didn't qualify under the then existing Anabolic Steroid Control Act. And he was arrested by state agents who brought him to court, and the judge set $1 million bond on him. $1 million for pro-hormones. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. We wound up getting him out. The definition of a steroid under Virginia law that existed at that time was different than the definition federally, and every state can have its own definitions and laws. And so there was a question as to whether these were steroids under Virginia law. My goal was, given the aggressiveness, they were talking about 20 years in prison, just crazy stuff. I wanted that case to go federal. So I wound up just, in kind of a papering to death the state prosecutor, and basically saying, look, this is a very niche kind of thing. This should be a federal case. Without saying it in those words, basically you're in over your head, and why don't you just send it over to the feds? They'll screw him anyway. I mean, they're gonna it's a federal case. You think this guy should go to prison so long? Let the feds deal it. Like as if I was scared of that. But obviously I was baiting him. I wanted him to send it federally. It did go federally, and he wound up getting probation at the end of the day. So state and federal, it depends. Typically in a cocaine or a heroin conspiracy, you'd rather be in a state court than a federal court. Typically, you're looking, because the guidelines for those kind of cases can make your nose bleed, right? But with steroids, it really can depend, and that's one of the things that, if you have a trained eye, an experienced lawyer can make those assessments, and to some extent, in some cases, you can actually maybe help it to go in one direction or another.
What came about with like a couple of years ago with the telehealth with the testosterone?
Right.
Where is that, or is it resolved, or what happened there?
Yeah. So a law was passed back in 2008, I guess, that required for telehealth, essentially, that there has to be a face-to-face interaction, some sort of, in-person physical exam of the person, evaluation of the person, because a kid had gotten opiates over the internet, just basically ordered them from a clinic, and he overdosed and he died. And so Congress passed a law, really because of opiate addiction, that, because steroids are also scheduled, applies to testosterone. And so in order to do a testosterone prescription based on that law, you had to have some sort of in-person evaluation, some physical evaluation of it. And that's probably good medicine anyway, I would guess, right? I mean, you shouldn't be prescribing, the argument, I guess, is, you could have a testicular, some sort of testicular growth, or, prostate the size of a cantaloupe, or something that maybe you'd want to think twice about certain medications. So that kind of was put on hold when the pandemic hit. And so under the national emergency, it was suspended because we wanted people to be able to get medications, even though they weren't allowed to leave their houses. And I was in New York, where, you know, everything was just put on ice for a while. My gym, I'm wearing the B.E.D.S sweatshirt here. B.E.D.S was closed for 5 months. I was training in my basement, you know. So that sort of moratorium, that kind of hiatus on the face-to-face, the, you know, in-person evaluation remains on hold, but DEA is evaluating how to deal with that. And, you know, I think in you know, we'll ultimately have they tried to come up with some new proposed way of addressing it that would have allowed, in some situations, like a two-way audio-visual kind of interaction would, with certain bells and whistles, be allowed to suffice for it. That got a lot of resistance, primarily from the community of addiction specialists who said that really wouldn't work for people who really need to be prescribed certain medications to get them off heavier medications. And so right now, that's a moratorium. When we talked a little bit before about sort of, will there ever be a time where, you know, is there any movement to remove testosterone from the Controlled Substances Act? And the only thing that's come up in all these years was a few years ago, the two senators from Massachusetts, U.S. senators, sent a letter to the Biden administration asking them to remove testosterone from the Controlled Substances Act, or to at least lower it to maybe Schedule 5 instead of Schedule 3. And the theory to do that was the idea that the restrictions that apply to testosterone impact negatively the trans community of people who are born or assigned female at birth and are looking to become either men or more masculine along a non-binary spectrum, that those people are being treated, because of the restrictions on testosterone, differently from the people who are assigned male at birth and looking to go in the other direction. You know, estrogen is not a controlled substance, and that would be the primary treatment for somebody who with gender dysphoria, who's looking to become more feminized when they're assigned male at birth. Why is it restricted in one direction and not the other? And there have been stories from the trans community, from the LGBT community, that about, you know, how lesser access is negatively impacting the trans community. And so it was really, that was the focus. Now, if nothing really came of it, at least so far, whether that descheduling would be limited to that particular use, or whether bodybuilders, you know, the bodybuilding world and the steroid using world were like, wow, go trans. You got suddenly, you know, the strange bedfellows, you know, you've got these allies now. But where that'll go, I don't know. But that's really the only way that I see right now that somebody's advocating for a reduction in the punishments or the restrictions that apply from scheduling of steroids.
What are some of the things that are happening now, you know, as far as, I think I saw one of your posts where I know there was a time period with my prescription, I could only get the small vials instead of the big vial, which is stupid to me because it costs more to make 10 of those, and it does that. It didn't make any sense.
Right.
Where's that come from?
Yeah. So that's, I'm in New York, and I'm seeing those things in New York. So New York likes to regulate and restrict. Yeah. You know, I don't think it's happening in some other states. You know, New York just passed a law, as you probably know, that restricts the sale of either muscle building or weight loss dietary supplement products to, you know, only people over the age of 18. So if you're under 18, you can't buy creatine. You can't buy something that's marketed for metabolism. You can't buy something that's a weight loss drug or a weight loss supplement. You know, protein is excluded, but if it's protein and creatine together, you can't sell it. And that's both online to New York and in New York. So it's a very restrictive law.
So where's that come from?
That comes from the idea that there are people who are, suffering from eating disorders, and that these products either cause eating disorders or exacerbate eating disorders. And to me, it makes no sense. And the emperor has no clothes in this, but there are advocates who are pushing that narrative very hard. I was 16 years old and I was taking protein powders and, desiccated liver pills back in the day, the big ones and all that stuff. And I don't think there's any danger associated with creatine. It's one of the most heavily researched of all sports nutrition products. But, there's pushback. I think there's a lawsuit that's been filed to try to stop the Attorney General of New York from enforcing this. But New York is very restrictive. And so New York also is the only state that made anabolic steroids Schedule 2. Everywhere else, federally and in every other state that ever scheduled it in the country, it's 3, Schedule 3. And the schedule that you're in is correlated with the potential for abuse and dependency. So obviously, if it's Schedule 1, you can't even prescribe it. It's marijuana is still Schedule 1. But Schedule 5, well, there's some potential for abuse and dependency, but it's less than 4. And so, the abuse dependency potential seems to me to be not related to the geographic boundaries of a particular state. It's not like the people of New York are going to be much more addicted to steroids than the people of Ohio. It's absurd. But yet that's exactly what the New York legislature did. It looked at all the others and said, well, we're gonna restrict it more. And there's more record keeping, there's more reporting, red tape and all of that in New York than there is anywhere else in the country. And so, I have heard that 2 things are happening. You do see this, some of the big chain pharmacies refusing to give out the 10 cc vial and instead giving the little, 1 ml kind of where you have to go back every month for it's absurd. But I'm also seeing doctors who are not urologists or endocrinologists suddenly pulling themselves out of the prescribing of TRT. And trying to refer now because some of the big, what's happening, the old model of a doctor actually owning his or her own business is rapidly disappearing. And those practices are being bought up by these huge hospital networks. And then you're ultimately a doctor working, you're getting a salary and working for some big, hospital group. And those hospital groups are now pressuring the doctors to get out of any of this TRT prescribing. The FDA in 2019 put a black box warning on testosterone, saying that it's linked to cardiovascular, heart attacks, and stroke problems, and they based it on some studies, which if you read the studies and really digested the data, it's not there.
Is some of this coming from the insurance companies? Because I see a vast difference between private pay and insurance pay. Right. So if my physician is private pay, then he doesn't have to worry about the prior authorizations and all the things that are associated with the insurance company. And then if my pharmacy is private pay, then it seems to me like there's less red tape. To be able to go that process compared to if, I go to this doctor that is covered, and then this pharmacy, which is covered. There's the issues that you're talking about where it's that.
I think it is. I think that's a component to it, but it's not exclusive to that because there are a lot of people who are private pay. Insurance is not involved. And, they now show up to just get their prescription at CVS or whatever. And CVS says, no, we're not giving you a 10 ml. We're going to give you, this little thing, and we need you back here every month with a new handwritten, a new physical prescription. Why are people doing that? So a lot of people are now going to the TRT clinics in Florida or Texas or states that are a little less regulatory, and there are issues with some of those as well, because some of those clinics go too far. You know, I've seen some of them prescribing different types of anabolics that it might be hard to justify.
Yeah.
You know, why does this person need Anavar? Yeah, you know, his Anavar levels, it's Anavar replacement.
Yeah.
You know,
or equipoise.
Well, right. Yeah. Trenbolone.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So you've got that. And that's problematic. And there's also, you know, the whole peptide issue that's come up, and BPC 157 and TB 500, which, you know, if you're in the gym world, you know, people who are regularly using these for different types of injuries, and many of them anecdotally will swear by it and say, yeah, my shoulder feels so much better. But there's not a lot of research on these things, and they're not FDA approved, which is sort of the standard of safety and efficacy that at least the government says you can't use something until it passes that, other than maybe certain things that are experimental that were allowed. But
so where'd the push from that come from, you know, to make it scheduled?
So BPC 157 and TB 500 are not scheduled in any way. Those are, you know, they're just unapproved.
Yeah.
So then the question is, well, can doctors prescribe unapproved drugs? You know, I'm not sure that FDA would say they can. I'm not sure that a state medical licensing board would say that they can, and I'm not sure that the medical malpractice policy that a doctor has would say that they can. I think if most doctors looked at their medical malpractice policies, they'd see that there's an exclusion, that they're not covered if they're you know, you can't prescribe things that FDA didn't approve. So there's issues all there, potential lawsuit issues as well, even if there's not a criminal component of it. And you know, I'm not sure on that. But doctors are prescribing those things. Is it a bad thing? You know, well, doctors are taking some risks. The alternative, of course, is that there's also websites selling these same things with no doctor involved whatsoever, no screening, no monitoring, no supervision. It's just, you know, go online, go to this website and get your peptides sent to your house and inject them. And, you know, I'd rather have them in the hands of doctors than,
well, there's no quality control either.
None. Sure. It's God only knows where they're coming from or what's in them. And I've represented a lot of research chemical companies through the years, you know, which is, by research chemical company, I mean a guy who gets peptides from Asians from China and sets up a website and puts up some disclaimers that say for research purposes only. And, you know, you go on the website and you click some boxes and you click a disclaimer that says, I'm a researcher and I'm not using this for human consumption. And then they're sent to your house. And those products sometimes come in vials where from Asia, where the Chinese supplier will send an email saying the yellow tops are BPC, the blue tops are TB 500, the gold tops are GHRP 6, whatever, melanotan 2 is the silver top, whatever. And unfortunately, I've seen when FDA has gone after some of these cases, and I've represented a lot of clients, sometimes it's all wrong. What you thought was the BPC was actually melanotan, what you thought was, and whether the Chinese manufacturer just mixed up the color tops or whatever. So when you say quality control, you're injecting things from somebody's kitchen who imported it. It's, I'd certainly rather have a doctor involved in this equation. But these companies do wind up on the receiving end of indictments, because it's ironic, because I think the reason that disclaimer exists of saying this is for research purposes, not for human consumption, is that the marketer recognizes that if you didn't say that and you're saying, hey, use this, it's a drug. You're not a pharmacist. Mm-hmm. You can't be, distributing drugs without, some authority to do it. And so it's criminal to do that. So by saying it's for research, well, then it's not a drug, it's a chemical. And so it's not for somebody to use to affect the structure or function of their bodies, which is the definition of a drug in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so you're trying to, it's this little loophole so that it's not a drug. The problem is that loophole is what is the basis for the charge by the government in these cases, because the loophole in the eyes of the government is fraud. You're saying it's for chemical, it's just a chemical for research, but you're selling it under circumstances that show that that's not true. You're marketing it on a bodybuilding forum. Yeah. You're shipping it to private residences and college dormitories. You're interacting with emails with people who call themselves young and jacked at gmail.com. All of this shows this was a facade, and you set this disclaimer up to fool FDA into thinking it's something that it's not. And that's the theory by which these cases are prosecuted. And I've handled a lot of them. And there are a lot of very unique issues. Even though they're charged as fraud cases, there's some very unique issues that make it different than any other fraud case that most lawyers handle. So I wind up getting a lot of these cases, and I have a whole bag of tricks that I use in these cases, which are legitimate arguments, but which the prosecutors may really not have recognized or thought of. So I come in with the more you've done something, the better you get at it, and the more you like what you do, the better you're going to get at it. And I've gotten very, very good at these sorts of cases. With
a gray area, if it's an online coach, that's speaking to somebody and they're talking about their cycle.
Right.
That's gray as hell, right? Because
where does the First Amendment end, and where does criminal conduct begin? Yeah. Well, it's the devil's in the details. Certainly just saying things, typically with some limited exceptions, is protected by the First Amendment. Once it's monetized in some way, that's a step toward it being more of a criminal thing. Certainly providing information. So here's where you go to get it. Well, okay, I use TB500 and, I don't sell it, but, Jimmy does, and here's his address. Well, at some point you become a co-conspirator to Jimmy, right? You're an aider and abettor of Jimmy's, conduct. So the devil's in the details, but, it's typically got to be more than just, hey, TB500 is good, and you may want to consider using it. That's probably protected by the First Amendment. How far we go in protecting the First Amendment is an interesting issue. I don't know. I don't know if you've heard of the case of Missouri versus Biden. But there's a link on my Instagram, and there's links. If you go to my bio on Instagram, you'll come up with a link tree of various things that I've written, podcasts I've done. I'm sure this podcast will be up there at some point. And it was a case where a few state attorneys general sued the administration because under the claim that the administration was impacting the First Amendment and was having a chilling effect on the First Amendment, not directly, but by cracking down on social media platforms and influencing the social media platforms to either cancel people's accounts or to shadow ban people who were maybe talking about certain narratives that the government didn't like, particularly over the last couple of years. It went to court, and the decisions, there's an article, my take on it is on my bio, and I put links to the actual court decisions so people could read them for themselves and make their own mind up about whether there was overreaching or not, or whether some of the agencies that were involved acted appropriately. I'm not a fan of censorship in any way, shape, or form. Typically, certainly there are some things you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. I mean, we can go over where speech transcends legality and where we need to stop certain speech, but by and large, I think the way that you battle misinformation or false information is to rebut it with truthful information. And what we found, I think, over the last few years is that some things that were called misinformation have turned out not to have been misinformation, and what was purportedly information turned out to be the misinformation in some cases. And so I think having robust debate, rather than suppressing bad ideas, we rebut them with good ideas, and you're seeing this play out on college campuses now to a degree too, where there's this mentality that if I don't agree with a particular narrative or a particular speaker's ideology, the way I deal with it is to ban him from the campus, to stop him, to protest, to try to get him canceled so that he can't speak. So I won't hear what he has to say. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think, we need to hear what people who have different ideas than we have to say. We have to listen, and we may not agree with it. We may say, you know what, I don't buy that. I'm going to continue to believe what I believe, or, I think there's a great value to just being open to always being open to the possibility that, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe you're not a bad person, even if I don't agree with what you have to say. And we're kind of losing that as a society. So I've written a lot about this stuff over the last few years. I've got a few little topic areas that I talk about in some of the podcasts I've done that you've probably seen, whether it's this censorship and freedom of speech issue, or whether it's sort of the safe space issue. I've written and spoken a lot about that. I'm not a fan of safe spaces. I think nothing good happens. Nothing grows in a safe space.
Echo chambers.
Well, yeah, sure. You just are confronted with nothing other than what you already believe. So you're never challenged, and you're coddled so that you never hear anything that is in any way different than what you're comfortable with. And as that happens, I think you become less and less resilient and weaker and more fragile. There's this myth, I think, of fragility. You can either look at it, either we're inherently resilient or we're inherently fragile. And I think we're now in a national narrative where we've come to believe that we're inherently fragile. So we need to be protected by the government, typically, or others, to prevent us from hearing anything, from seeing anything. Where it's like, metaphorically wearing helmets all day in case we're exposed to something that might trigger us or upset us or offend us. And I think that's a bad place to be. I think a friend of mine says that the military has a saying that you need to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And discomfort is how you grow. And I always make the analogy to bodybuilding, right? I mean, how do you grow? How do you improve? You subject yourself to stress, and the higher the level of stress to a point is what causes the adaptive response to the growth, right?
Yes.
It's to the challenge. So that's how you grow. So if you go to the gym and, this wonderful facility that we're in right now, and you do those 10 reps at that weight, and you never do an 11th rep, you never go beyond. At some point, it gets comfortable to do the 10 reps, but you're never going to grow from that. You're only going to grow when you do that 11th rep and that 12th rep. And those are going to be the ones that are painful. Those are the ones that are going to cause the greatest stress. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to like it. You're going to be in pain. But from that pain, from that stress, from that discomfort, that's where the adaptive response comes. That's where you grow. And if you never subject yourself to that, whether it's in the gym or in college or anywhere that you never subject yourself to that stress, you're never going to grow. I think adversity and struggle is where growth comes from. That's what builds your character the way that those 11th and 12th reps build your biceps.
Well, I don't really know anybody that disagrees with that. It's
I live in a
bubble,
go to a college campus.
Yeah.
Go to a college campus today. I think we've gone in a very different direction. Even in law schools, you may have seen, there was a law school where a speaker was a judge, and he was shouted down by a law school class. These are going to be the future, the future of my profession, who shouted him down because they felt unsafe by his political ideology. That's a dangerous place to be. We grew up in an age where feeling unsafe was restricted to physical issues, right? I mean, I'm on the edge of a cliff and I'm looking down thousands of feet. And if I lean forward too far, I'm going to fall. I don't feel safe. Okay, that's great. But if I don't feel safe just because you're saying an idea that is different from what I've been indoctrinated to believe, that's a problem. And I think, we're all in our bubbles, but that is going on, whether you see it here out in the hinterlands of Ohio or not.
Do you see a pushback against it?
I do. I think there's now kind of a pushback going on, and I think it's super important. How long it's going to take to get there, I don't know. But I think we have to push back, at least to recognize that we've gone too far in safetyism, and it's risk and it's challenge. I always say I'm a better bodybuilder. I'm a better lawyer for having been a bodybuilder, because bodybuilding teaches those lessons where struggle and adversity and pain is what makes you grow and get better, and you've got to be willing to do it. Determination and perseverance and overcoming the obstacles of injuries. We've all had them. I was kidding around with you before that there's a meme on social media where it's a picture of different joints on fire, like the red heat all around the knee and the lower back, and it says what the predator sees when he chases me, right? I mean, we years of heavy lifting, you pay the price, but that's what made you grow, and that's how you developed. And I think that's super important. A couple of years ago, I was on my roof cleaning some gutters or something, and for the first time I felt a little queasy about the height, looking down, and I'd never had an issue with heights before. And so I had to make a decision of what do I do? And certainly one option is to never put yourself in a position where, you're subjected to that. But the other alternative is the alternative that I chose, which was I set up a charity skydive, and I jumped out of a plane at 13,500 feet. Because I was terrified to do it. But to me, that was a way of confronting that limitation or that weakness and overcoming it and, eating it, and absorbing it. And I've since done 5 skydives. I got a USPA skydiver's license. I want to recertify and actually do some solo jumps and all. But the reality is you've got to challenge yourself like that. And whatever scares you is what you should do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing to do. Not the stuff that doesn't scare you. But I speak a lot about this sort of stuff as well. I wrote a book with a co-author a few years ago called Alpha Male Challenge, and it's available on Amazon and stuff. And it's a training book. It's diet, it's exercise, not a powerlifter's book or a bodybuilder's book, but for guys looking to get their mojo back, 30 and over, really just trying to reclaim their best selves. And there's a whole section on attitude and sort of like alpha attitude and alpha male being defined as being your best without being an asshole. Yeah. Right. You know, and a lot of the book is the attitude aspect of the book is based on the idea that you need to challenge yourself. You need to confront what scares you, and that will make you better. And it's very empowering. I don't know if you've ever done a skydive, but it's incredibly empowering. And the more afraid you are to do it, the more you get out of it, because statistically you're going to be fine. It's it's safer than driving in many instances, but subjectively, when you look out and you see the curve of the earth and there's literally nothing but empty air between you and, a couple miles down the ground, and you just sort of rock out of that airplane into the abyss. It is it's an experience that when you land, and you land safely, and you will land safely, it feels as if you've kicked death in the nuts. It feels like you have dared the fates. You have, knocked death down. There's almost like an immortality of empowerment that is like nothing you can. And the more afraid you are of it, the more you get out of it, and the more empowering it is. Because I have friends who've done skydives. They're adrenaline junkies. They do the first skydive, and it's like, yeah, man, let's do that again. It was like no real big deal. But it's the person who's absolutely terrified to do it, who is shaking in their boots about the idea of it, and then does it, and survives it, which they will. That really comes to think, I never thought I could do that, and I did it. I found the part of me to be able to do that. What else can I do? What other self-imposed limitations are holding me back? What else can I challenge myself with that will broaden me and strengthen me in all aspects of my life? So I recommend, do whether it's that or other ways of challenging yourself.
Were there any topics you wanted to cover I didn't bring up?
How long have we gone, man?
I have no idea.
Yeah, well, we've gone 2 hours. No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about anything. We could talk more about some cases I've had. We can talk about, more philosophy or empowerment stuff. One of the fun cases I had a few years ago that I've told this story, and you may have heard it, is that I had a New York guy who had gone to Mexico and driven his car down there. He was a school teacher, and he drove down there to get some steroids for him and his gym buddies, and put them in the trunk of his car. He's coming back. I think he was coming through Alabama on what was probably a high drug trafficking highway for not steroids, but for, so trooper sees the car, sees New York plates. He's pulled over. Trooper says to the guy, where are you coming from? Oh, I'm coming from Mexico, and had a little party down there. Saw some friends, and and I'm on my way back. Okay, you mind popping open the trunk? So he's a school teacher, educated guy, smart guy, knows the law to a degree, and says, you know what? I have nothing to declare. I haven't done anything wrong, but yeah, I'm going to stand on my rights. I'm not consenting to you opening the trunk of my car. Trooper says, really? Goes, okay, well, tell you what, I'm going to call up the canine unit, and we're going to get the canine unit here, and the dog's going to sniff. And if the dog finds something in your trunk, going to be a big problem because that dog is mean dog, and that dog will scratch up all your pain. We barely can contain it. Could even I'm going to try to keep you away, but it could bite you. Could get you. You sure you don't want to let me in that trunk? He's like, yeah, I'm quite sure. I'm not consenting to you going in the trunk. Okay, so calls up the canine unit. They're waiting like 20 minutes. 1 or 2 times he comes over to the guy and tries again to say, listen, it could be, I don't know how far, it could be hours. I don't want to keep you here. Just open the trunk and let me see what's in there. Of course, that's where the steroids are. He says no. Finally, the canine unit comes. Handler comes there. This crazy, angry dog that's going to scratch up all the paint and destroy the car, walks around the car once, twice, and just sits down. Doesn't do anything else. The trooper goes over to the canine unit, and the teacher overhears a piece of the conversation where the handler for the canine unit says, "We ain't got shit." Trooper walks over to the teacher and says, "It's a hit." He says it's a hit. He goes, no. He said, "We ain't got shit." He didn't say it's a hit. He said shit, not hit. He goes, no. He said hit. Open the trunk. Pops open the trunk, and lo and behold, there's steroids. There's a lot of Winstrol, as I remember, in there. And so guy gets charged, and the case winds up going to trial. Crazy situation. And the issue becomes, well, did they have a right to open the trunk, and was the dog reliably trained on steroids? And I remember, this was a number of years ago, I called every canine handler I could find nationwide, and I could not find anyone who had ever trained a dog to determine, to find, to hit on an anabolic steroid of any kind.
Yeah.
And some said it was theoretically possible, I guess, but nobody had ever done it. And when I had asked for the discovery on this case, their training manual for the dog was, with respect to steroids, was one handwritten word, Winstrol. They just wrote on there, which certainly looked very suspicious. And it wound up at the end of the day, he was exonerated. But it just goes to show, even if you do enforce your, what your best interests are in terms of a search and not consenting to a warrantless search, that's not necessarily the way that it can end. And that's where a good lawyer can come in and make a difference.
What's the best way people can find you?
So I'm pretty accessible. I've got a website at rickcollins.com, and that talks about sort of the federal cases and the federal system, even though I do a lot of state cases too, but I do a lot of federal work. Most of my work is probably federal now because those are the bigger cases. So rickcollins.com is an easy one. Many years ago, I wrote a book called Legal Muscle, which, there are still some copies floating around somewhere on eBay or something. They usually overcharge like ridiculous amounts for them. And then that led to my writing a column for Muscular Development magazine, which I wrote for well over 20 years. And at some point wrote, Legal Muscle while that was going on, and started a website called steroidlaw.com. And that's still there. And it's just a little information about steroids and the law, so those are the websites. I'd say I'm probably most active on Instagram. And so people can go to Rick Collins ESQ and just follow me on Instagram. And I try to post, today I actually posted a chart that I made of how the steroid unit guidelines are calculated, which it doesn't exist anyway. I made the chart. It's probably useful to lawyers who handle these, anybody else who tried to handle a case like this, but also for people to know. So I try to post, there's some personal stuff and some of my lifting stuff. I still lift, I train hard. I think anybody who knows me from BEVs will tell you that I'm one of the regulars.
I want some meathead always boys and meathead, right?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I love sort of those two pieces. I have one foot in the legal community. I was the president of one of the largest suburban bar associations in the country. I'm very active in the New York State Bar Association and in the American Bar Association. I'm part of committees and task forces in both of those. So I walk in sort of the professional world of lawyers, but I'm also, and I thought about, well, if you've seen most of my podcasts, I'm usually wearing either a sport jacket or something like that.
No, I love that you wore this.
And I said to myself, well, I'm in this incredible facility, this gym facility that Dave Tate has created here. I'm not going to show up in a sport jacket, and people who know who I am, they know my shtick. This is the way I dress 5 days a week when I walk into the gym. And I love that I'm in that world too, and continue to be part of the bodybuilding world. I never thought, circling back, that when I kind of finished my competitive bodybuilding career and started my legal career, that somehow those two completely disparate, environments would somehow merge into one single professional, identity where, as sort of like the bodybuilding lawyer, where I was, because nobody had ever really done it before. There was a lawyer many years ago called Clarence Bass, if you remember him. He had a column in Muscle and Fitness back in the day. But timing, it just worked that the year that I went into private practice was the year that steroids were criminalized, and suddenly the guys in the gyms from the 80s were now federal drug criminals. And so I started getting phone calls and people asking me, well, how do I understand what's happening in the courts? And then, of course, the people in the courts had no clue about what was happening in the gyms. So I became sort of the go-between, the bridge of information to those two things. And it's been an incredible ride. I've represented a lot of sports nutrition companies. I represented Sylvester Stallone's company, Instone, back in the day. That was a great experience. I did a lot of work with Ben Weider for the IFBB back in the day, also great. I worked with a lot of the sports nutrition pro-hormone companies, represented many of them in criminal capacities after the government started to crack down on that. I got some time to spend with Arnold Schwarzenegger in his office above Shotzi, Maine, in Santa Monica.
You'll work with companies too in the supplement industry to prevent issues.
Yes. So I'd say, part of my practice is the preventive, the regulatory, sort of keeping people out of trouble.
Yeah.
And then the other part, which is probably the more lucrative part, is getting people out of the trouble that they are in, either because they didn't call me for advice or didn't know me or whatever, and now they find themselves in a situation. And I enjoy both, certainly, and I like keeping people out of trouble is a great thing. And I represent a lot of good sports nutrition companies that are doing the right thing, even though we see on the news supplements are unregulated, and there's all these attacks on the dietary supplement community, especially the sports nutrition market. So I feel good about doing that sort of work. But I love and it's super rewarding to have somebody who's, who I can really make a major difference, because they were looking at, what for many people is the worst thing that's happened to them, certainly professionally in their lives. It's like a terrible medical diagnosis. You've got a state or sometimes the feds who now want to put you, if the feds come after you, they're not coming after you because they want to give you probation. Typically, they're coming after you because they want money and jail and all of those things. And to be able to be the defender of that person, to try to be the barrier between what the government wants to do to people. And, look, if everybody were to be judged only on the the bad thing that they did in their life and not all those other things. That's unfair. And as criminal defense lawyers, what we have to do is try to get a judge or a prosecutor to recognize that you can't be summed up by the one stupid, thing that you did. I mean, even if it was monetarily based or whatever it is. And so, so I feel very good about that. And like I said before, a lot of my clients, the people who call me, you can go to look at some of my reviews and testimonials. And I love that because people really appreciate, the work that I do for them. I've made this huge difference in people's lives. And to me, that's keeps me going, gets me up in the morning. I love getting up on a Monday morning. I love going to work. And there aren't a lot of lawyers, who feel that way. There are some who are kind of unhappy. And that's unfortunate. Doctors too. But I love what I do, Dave.
Well, I want to thank you for coming out. This has been a pleasure. Guys, thanks for listening, and we're done.
So if you do any kind of pull, if you're doing a pull, even if you're pulling through the transverse plane, like a row where you're kind of abducted at 90 degrees, there's still some lats in that. They still pull on the humerus, right? So if you're doing a row, you pull the arms behind the body, you're going to get the traps, you're going to get the lats. So they're still getting stimulus.